On December 6, 2011, a 25-minute animation titled Kyousougiga was uploaded to Nico Nico Doga, the Japanese alternative to YouTube, and in the following year an additional 5 videos ranging from 7 to 12 minutes in length were released. Later, on October 2, 2013, the original 25-minute animation was re-released on television with a new soundtrack and cuts as a commemoration for the 10-episode anime, also titled Kyousougiga, that followed in the anime fall season of the same year. As an interesting note, Wikipedia says this commemorative episode is titled Introductory Chapter, Crunchyroll has it listed as Episode 0 Preview, and my subtitles have translated the title as Recap, but regardless of what this episode actually is, the first thing you should know if you haven't watched Kyousougiga is that you should not watch this episode. Or rather, I don't recommend that you watch it first, but if you do, you should keep in mind that by and large, this episode is not canon in regards to the 2013 anime. In fact, as you compare this episode 0 to the events of the anime, there are so many inconsistencies between them that the original animation feels like a strange fanfiction. Or maybe it's the other way around. In any case, it's obvious that while the characters remain the same between the two, many fundamentals had to be changed in the making of the anime for the sake of telling a much longer story. However, despite the 10 episodes being much more substantial, the second thing you should know about watching Kyousougiga is that you will be confused. It's very common that Kyousougiga gives you information only to contradict it later or even never bring it up again regardless of how important it seems to be. In fact, I can't think of anything in this anime that somehow doesn't end up having some sort of inconsistency, but on top of that there's a heavy use of symbolism which always complicates matters when you neither understand what is going on or have the concepts that the anime may be referencing. As you can imagine, this made it somewhat difficult for me to make this video given that I had to piece together some form of an understanding on my own, which in part is why this took so long to make, as well as the 160 hours I spent playing Elden Ring. Regardless, once I finished wrapping my mind around the absurdities and pieced the story together, I discovered that Kyousougiga wasn't really about anything. Now that's not to say that it doesn't have any meaning or substance, rather what I mean to say is that it's like a grocery store that hosts a wide variety of foods, but it isn't about any of those foods. The food is just there, and in the same way that Kyousougiga's story has a general realm of concepts, it isn't about any of them in particular. Welcome to Labra Stories. As should be obvious by this point, this video contains spoilers for everything in Kyousougiga that I felt was necessary to talk about, but whether you watch the anime or not, the one thing we can all be sure of is that Kyousougiga is strange. As the opening narration of the middle 8 episodes of Kyousougiga states, once upon a time when the many worlds bordered each other and the line between God and human was thin, there was a certain family whose story of love and rebirth we will follow, and to that end it begins by introducing said family. The first member we meet is the father priest Myoe, who lives in Kyoto and has the ability to turn anything he paints into a reality. Unfortunately, the locals don't take too kindly to such strange abilities, resulting in them eventually chasing priest Myoe out of the capital. As such, he now lives on a nearby mountain, spending his time painting the view of Kyoto as well as a black rabbit with red eyes named Koto, who he considers to be the god of the painted city. In time, the rabbit falls in love with Priest Myoe, but being a rabbit, they can't say so. However, as luck would have it, a Buddha Vista is watching the pair through a picture of the Buddha. Additionally, with their future-seeing eyes, the Buddha Vista prophesies that Koto's love will solve some problem that Priest Myoe has, and so they give their body and abilities to Koto. With this, the two gradually grow close together and eventually adopt their youngest son Yakushimaru, followed by the painted siblings of the eldest Kurama the Sage and the middle child Yase the Demon. Now, these 5 live together for some time, however due to some contrivance they end up fleeing into the painting of Kyoto. In order to do so, they slap a painting of a doorway onto the collage, and Koto uses a mirror that they got from somewhere to transport everyone into the land that is soon dubbed the Mirror Capital. Now we'll go more into depth on how the Mirror Capital operates in a bit, but I want to finish introducing all the characters first. So, some more time passes with the family enjoying a laid-back paradise until Koto begins having dreams of an apocalypse. Supposedly, said dreams are visions of a punishment that Koto will receive for not returning the body of the Buddha Vista, and so to ensure that the Mirror Capital isn't destroyed, the two parents decide to leave. However, in doing so, they not only abandon their children, said children are also trapped inside the Mirror Capital for several centuries. Fortunately, none of them die because they're all immortal, apparently, but regardless, after this significant time skip, a storm hits the Mirror Capital as our main character, a red-eyed, giant hammer-wielding 14-year-old girl, breaks in. Introducing herself, she says her name is Koto and that they're looking for a black rabbit with red eyes who they believe to be their mother. That said, Koto the child has never met Koto the rabbit, and so this assumption is based entirely on the fact that they have the same eye color and name, although it still doesn't seem to be a surprise that inevitably she ends up being correct. As such, we now have the entire Takayama-dera family tree, although they're currently separated, and hence the 4 children try to figure out how to get to their parents, and in doing so, Koto the child, as the newest member of the crew, gets to learn all about the Mirror Capital. So, now that we're on the topic, the rules of the Mirror Capital, or at least the rules as stated by the narrator, are as follows. The residents cannot die, nor do they age or give birth, and finally, any object that is broken gets fixed. That's it. Pretty simple, but of course, as you can see after the time skip, not only does the Mirror Capital have pretty advanced technology, the first 3 siblings have also aged to varying extents. So then, what's going on? I mean, if objects fix themselves, nothing can be broken, so then nothing can be created because any creation would basically explode as its materials are reconstituted back to where they came from. But despite this, Mirror Capital has somehow invented smartphones, vending machines, various vehicles, GPS, a flying saucer, a mecha, and to top it all off, a semi-illusory demi-plane thing. Don't ask me what that is. I have no clue. The characters just kind of show up there sometimes, and that's all we ever really know about it. More importantly, how did all of this come into being? Did someone figure out how to turn off the auto repair function? Was there a stash of conveniently shaped parts that they just had to put together? Did said materials or items wholesale get brought into the Mirror Capital? But then who brought them and how did they get in? Are they also immortal, or did they come in near the end of the time skip? Maybe. So to put it bluntly, I could probably spend more than 10 minutes talking about all the things that don't make sense about the Mirror Capital, as well as potential ways that the story might justify the inconsistency, but at the end of the day that wouldn't do us any good, because no matter how comprehensive any solution may be, Kyousougiga doesn't supply the evidence needed to back it up. That's just the way it is, which on the one hand makes the Mirror Capital utterly incomprehensible, but on the other hand I think that the audience being unable to understand the Mirror Capital has been done on purpose. Look at it this way, while growing up it was not an uncommon occurrence that your parents took you shopping, and so you went to, let's say, the grocery store. Now we all knew that this store sells food, but as for where that food came from, how it was grown, or by what means we buy it, well, that was a mystery to us. In a similar way, the Mirror Capital remains mysterious, not necessarily because the way it works is unrealistic, but because it's too complicated for its residents to understand, as they are all children. And it isn't as if the 3 children ever tried to figure out how the Mirror Capital works. After all, one of them supposedly invented all the modern technology, but despite their curiosity, the anime never supplies satisfying answers. I mean, imagine trying to explain the economy to a child. You would probably just say something like, money exists and giving the clerk a magic card lets us buy bread. As such, while we can clearly see that the world is much more complicated than what we've been told, we're also denied the truth because it simply wouldn't make sense, and it is upon this observation that I view the Mirror Capital as a representation of the worldview of a child. Of course, such a conclusion is partially an excuse to avoid trying to explain how the Mirror Capital manages to have a functioning economy, which we can all agree nobody would enjoy, but using this view we can also justify the ridiculous amount of time that has been skipped. After all, from the normal adult perspective, the time they spent as a child takes up a steadily decreasing percentage of their existence, but for the child, that time is all that they have ever experienced. Likewise, as Priest Myoe is a literal god, he has lived for the entirety of existence, and as such, the several centuries that have passed are but a drop in the bucket. Hence, the time skip is intentionally much longer than any person's lifespan for the purpose of making sure that any potential viewer of Kyousougiga would view the span of time like how a child views their existence as having been eternal. So then, we have an excuse for why the Mirror Capital itself hasn't abided by its rules, but then what about the matter of the children aging? Well, if we go back to some time after the family moved to the Mirror Capital, but before the parents leave, Yakushimaru comments that it's odd that he and his siblings haven't gotten older. Of course, the amount of time that has passed is obscure, perhaps a year given that at one point the trees bear cherry blossoms and at another time snow, but even that is enough for a young boy to recognize that at least one of them should have gotten taller. Then the parents leave, and as they have been managing the Mirror Capital, that role is now placed on the shoulders of the 3 siblings, who then band together to form some semblance of a government. As such, the siblings have taken up the mantle of responsibility, and it is because of this that they have grown older. In particular, the one that has aged the most is Kurama, because while all 3 are technically in charge, Yase is too impulsive to be given control, and Yakushimaru slacks off as much as he can, thus leaving all the work on the eldest. As such, it only makes sense that Kurama has aged the most, although that does stand at odds with the fact that he can't leave the Mirror Capital, but on the other hand, it could just be that he isn't responsible enough. I mean, I can't imagine that it takes much to watch over a land that by its nature does not change. If anything, the most chaotic entities are the siblings themselves, hence Kurama's comment in episode 3 that he isn't tired of governing, but that he's tired of babysitting. So, that's episode 1, and as you can probably tell, Kyousougiga loves to throw information around without explanation, which then leaves it up to the audience to figure out what's going on. After all, I just spent a few minutes talking about a couple small discrepancies that the anime barely even acknowledges, but as a byproduct of the anime not explaining itself, it also isn't clear whether it's building on itself. To illustrate, as we move into episodes 2 through 6, we've also moved into the part of the anime where each episode focuses on a single character. As a plus, this makes the episodes significantly less dense than the first, but on the other hand, there isn't a lot to be said about them. Now, that's not to say that they're unnecessary, because we don't know anything about Koto the child, and logically the other 3 siblings should have been deeply affected by having been abandoned for several centuries. However, while these aspects of the story get mentioned, I hesitate to say that any of them get explored. For example, let's take a look at episode 4, which focuses on Yase, who of all the children has the closest relationship with their parents. As such, it should stand to reason that she's been the most impacted by their abandonment, and yet the only thing that's changed is that she now hoards anything that reminds her of her mother. Now, to be fair, the episode does address that the underlying reason for this hoarding is Yase's fear that just as her lost items never return, her mother too will be lost forever, but the problem is that once Koto the child quickly resolves this centuries-long trauma, Yase's role in the story largely disappears. As such, it doesn't feel like Yase changes because we only get one episode to focus on her, and by extension, it's hard to say that any themes of the episode hold relevance, which can also be said for the rest of the episodes. Kurama's motivation to leave the Mirror Capital so that he can obtain and share information with the outside world is exactly the same as before the parents left, and Yakushimaru has done literally nothing for several centuries. You would think that if he were willing to waste all that time, he would have a solid reason, but all I can find are some vaguely mentioned factors that add up to him not wanting to be alive. Heck, even Koto, who's supposed to be the main character with the explicitly stated mission statement to find their mother, spends all their time either running around destroying buildings or conveniently helping whichever character's episode it currently is. Which is frustrating because the fact that the siblings were abandoned should be important and easily could have been a foundational part of the story. I mean, as far as the overarching narrative goes, the story is about reuniting the family, so then it only makes sense to explore how the children view their parents, but Kyousougiga doesn't go further than Yase missing her mother. As a result, it calls into question what the purpose of these episodes is, but perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. After all, it's not as if they're actually worthless, it's just that their presentation is at odds with the narrative, and as such, I suggest we re-examine them. Taking a step back, episode 2 is of course all about Koto the child, where she grew up, how she behaves, etc., and while we do get the mysterious information that the short mask-bearing man that has adopted Koto is actually Priest Myoe, there really isn't a lot going on. And that's not just because the information bombardment of the first episode isn't present, there really just isn't a lot going on. There's a 2-minute scene where Koto duels some random kid that isn't seen before or after this, a few long montages where you get to see Koto slacking off during school, images of her house or normal routines, and the part about Koto discovering who her parents are takes up about a third of the episode. Additionally, similar scenes can be found across other episodes in this section. Nearly 10 minutes of episode 3 follows Shoko, one of Kurama's assistants, looking for the controller to Bishamaru, and after the first few minutes of episode 5, all that's happened is Koto eating breakfast and Yakushimaru using a vending machine. The episodes are slow, so slow that I wouldn't be surprised if some consider them to be filler. However, I find that by taking its time, Kyousougiga allows us to simply observe how the characters live their lives. Now, I'm not going to hide the fact that I love the slice of life genre. I'm completely fine with having a show where the tensest event is someone learning how to make fried chicken, and while such a story is admittedly unexciting, it's also endlessly relatable. It's soothing to sit back and watch a character do mundane tasks that, despite all the messed up, crazy flurry of information infinity that is the context for wherever you are, both of you still have to pick up the pieces. Do laundry, cook, work, pay bills, and by doing so construct some sort of an understanding of how to place yourself in the world. But then there's an irony here because nobody has to do these things in the Mirror Capital. Or at least they shouldn't have to do them, but then again the mundane task could also just be any manner of hobby. In any case, this seems to be what Kyousougiga is saying, that by just having the characters live their lives to varying levels of quality, they're slowly making sense of how they place themselves in the world. Unfortunately, that world is about to be shattered. By the tail end of episode 7, Kurama has succeeded in bringing their mother back, with her father following shortly after, and then the mirror capital suddenly falling apart. Of course, as this is Kyousougiga, the anime somehow manages to make it unclear as to why this is happening by graciously supplying 3 explanations. The first is, of course, that Koto the rabbit is being punished for not returning the body of the Buddha Vista. However, this doesn't really work, given that if that were a real stake of the story, then either the mirror capital would have been destroyed before the time skip, or Koto the rabbit would have returned to being a rabbit. The second explanation, and the one that is largely pushed by the narrative, is that the mirror capital is falling apart because of something that Koto the child did. Now on the surface this seems pretty reasonable because of course Koto the child destroys important things without a second thought, and indeed, as we eventually learn, she smashed the painting of the mirror capital with her hammer, which resulted in her getting transported to the mirror capital for reasons, as well as its eventual destruction. Or at least that's what she's told by her father and the leader of Shrine, the chief priest. In fact, not only does the chief priest claim that Koto the child has caused the fall of the mirror capital, but as a result the entirety of existence is crumbling, which sounds a bit suspect. I mean, as the chief priest also tells us, there are 12 dimensions that people live on, but if they all break when one does, then why is there even more than one? And why 12 specifically? In any case, the chief priest isn't against the mirror capital specifically because it's ending the world, but because there aren't supposed to be more than 12 dimensions. Hence, as the mirror capital is the 13th dimension, it should not be allowed to exist, but that begs the question of why it's been around for so long. I mean, on the one hand, Koto the child smashed the painting some time ago, so then it seems too convenient for the mirror capital to suddenly be falling apart, and on the other hand, if Shrine was really against the mirror capital, then why haven't they done something about it in the last several centuries? As one solution, Priest Myoe claims that it's because he hid it really well, but that's not actually true. We learn in episode 3 that one of Kurama's assistants, Fushimi, works for Shrine as a double agent, and as of when Priest Myoe first painted the mirror capital, Shrine could have literally walked up a mountain to find it. Hence, Shrine has known about the mirror capital for a significant amount of time, and they haven't done anything, leaving us with the third explanation. Said explanation is that the mirror capital's collapse was always inevitable, and of course, this plays right into my interpretation of the mirror capital. However, what's important is what Kyousougiga does with this explanation. So, as my interpretation goes, with the mirror capital falling, the children are growing up. The previous tranquility is being shattered, and they're getting catapulted into the world of the adults whether they want it or not. Now, as Koto the child has lived in the mirror capital for some time, it has become a place dear to her, and so, understandably, she doesn't want it to be destroyed. Of course, with all the adults telling her that all this destruction is her fault, she gets depressed, but in time she sees through their lies. She sees that she isn't responsible for their destruction, the adults just want her to move on from being a child, which Koto fundamentally disagrees with. After all, if she was allowed to exist here until she was ready to be an adult, then it doesn't make sense for the experience to be wiped out, and that's exactly what she tells the chief priest. She wants the mirror capital to be protected, and she's also willing to become an adult by learning what in the world is really going on, but if that knowledge comes at the cost of what is essentially her entire being, then she's not going to have it. Might as well just go along with the destruction and restart from nothing. And I agree with Koto, maybe not the part about destroying the entirety of reality, but if there's a part of Kyousougiga that I would point to and say is cool, it's here. I mean, it's just refreshing for even one of Kyousougiga's themes to get a payoff, but in addition to that, this actually has quite a bit to do with some other concepts I've addressed. For example, I mentioned that the siblings were still in the mirror capital because they weren't responsible enough, and in large part they couldn't have that responsibility because of a lack of knowledge. As such, with Koto's declaration to accept that knowledge, all that is left to cement the transition is to accept the responsibility that comes with it. Now admittedly, Kyousougiga does this in a somewhat disjointed manner because it stops focusing on Koto the child in favor of Yakushimaru, but responsibility is addressed regardless. For context, way back when Priest Myoe left the mirror capital, he gave Yakushimaru a set of prayer beads, which as it turns out holds the power of creation. As such, Yakushimaru now also bears the responsibility that comes with that power, hence why he now resembles his adopted father, and why Priest Myoe is much younger. That said, despite this responsibility having been handed down, it's another thing for Yakushimaru to accept it. After all, his main problem is that he can't find a reason to live, so he doesn't care for the prayer beads. Hence, even though he could have escaped the mirror capital at any time, he never did, However, now that the apocalypse is happening, he steps into the role of protector as he never wished for others to get hurt. Of course, it feels like this change happens incredibly fast, and that's mostly due to Yakushimoto's character arc being inherently vague. I mean, the reason he doesn't want to be alive is because the original family was murdered, and upon discovering this, Yakushimoto decided to commit suicide for some reason that I cannot comprehend. Then, Priest Myoe just happened to come by and grant Yakushimoto immortality, which of course he didn't like for the same incomprehensible reason. But hey, this is Kyousougiga, why would we expect it to make any sense? In the end, Yakushimoto and Koto the child team up to restore the Mirror Capital, after which the family is reunited, and they all live happily ever after, which despite the chaotic nature of the narrative is still a fitting end that ties up all the threads. To summarize, Kyousougiga is about growing up. It's about being dropped into a confusing world and just having to figure out what you're supposed to do. Or at least that's one conclusion. As you might remember from my introduction, I said that Kyousougiga isn't about anything, and while that largely stands in opposition to what I've analyzed, I still think it's correct. To explain, what I've done with my analysis is I've taken a bucket and run it through the pond of ideas that constitutes Kyousougiga. Undoubtedly, the water I now have in my bucket is part of that pond, but by no means should anyone think that it is the whole pond. Likewise, while I've come to an understanding of that part, that is still just one interpretation based on the information that I was able to stick together, and there is so much more to explore. I mean, there's probably a whole lot of Buddhist imagery that I just straight up don't know about, as well as the subtext about love and family that I wasn't able to parse together. For all I know, I've completely missed the point, and the Mirror Capital is actually the afterlife, or something more akin to the oft-referenced Alice in Wonderland. Then again, maybe the fact that I could have missed the point is the point. That just as Kyousougiga supplies the audience with far more information than they should ever be expected to understand, so does life, and we just have to pick up the pieces to come to our own understanding. But whatever that may be for you isn't for me to say. Instead, all I can say is thanks for watching. Now go and get a slice of your own life.